Hello and welcome to Superhero Ethics. Today we are talking about time travel. We're talking about what makes logical sense and what doesn't. We're talking about how people use it in movies and TV shows. And we're talking about once time travel is a possibility, what is the morality of using it or choosing not to use it to address past or future problems? All this and more with special guest Rob McKenzie. After a commercial break we have no control over. Welcome back. My name is Matthew. I'm your host. I'm joined, as I mentioned, by Rob McKenzie, our guest, who has been a guest a couple times on the podcast on a couple of different topics that we've had you on to discuss magic and discuss Brandon Sanderson novels. And I was really thrilled to find out that you are a big fan of time travel and thinking all about time travel. So really glad to have you with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Yeah, I'm a science fiction reader. I read a ton of stuff and I think about it. And we talked about the ethics of AI before in relation especially to I was the science fiction writing side of things.
Right.
And there's a lot of stuff buried in time travel as well.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to chat about it.
Yeah, and I think I really am too, because and part of what inspired this, for folks who know me on some of my other Stranded Panda podcasts, PandaVision just wrapped up their set of episodes that I was on about Umbrella Academy. And I had a lot of problems with both Season 1 and Season 2, mostly relating to time travel. And I think I've become pretty much known as a person who is generally very grumpy about time travel. And I liked when talking with you offline, it helped me get an understanding of the fact that you really seem to have both a love for this, but also that you bring a pretty rigid analysis to how you look at time travel. And that somehow as part of that, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure comes up as a strong example.
Yes.
So this is kind of your chance to convince me that time travel isn't always bad, and also just to have a conversation about what is it that makes time travel make sense or not make sense, and how do we kind of wrap our brains around it?
Yeah, and the things that I want to talk about that we're not covering. So So time travel has a bunch of branches, and it's been, as far as literary treatments of it, it's been around for a very long time.
Right.
And so I want to talk about the types that I don't want to talk about, basically, so that people don't get too excited about some of the stuff.
Yeah, we don't want this to be a 10-hour podcast, so we're going to narrow the focus.
So I don't want to talk about precognition. So like the movie Minority Report, which I have opinions on, as you can probably guess, we're not going to talk about that. I don't want to talk about parallel universes or alternate histories that are just like what ifs. So like The Man in the High Castle was just on Netflix. That's based on Philip K. Dick's story, and both Minority Report and Man in the High Castle are actually Philip K. Dick. But I don't want to talk about alternate histories. Those are super fascinating. They're super interesting. They raise a lot of questions. I don't want to. Yeah. I don't want to spend this podcast talking about them.
Yep.
Things that are experience loops. Groundhog Day is the classic example that everybody loves and knows. Edge of Tomorrow is another movie that does it. That is just this one person keeps their memory through a set of experiences. One of the top 5 episodes of Next Generation, Cause and Effect, is an experience loop. That's a whole other discussion.
Yeah.
And forward only big time jumps. A bunch of people qualify these as time travel, and what this strictly does is disqualify the Time Machine by H.G. Wells, or any Rip Van Winkle style story where somebody just wakes up much later or jumps forward. Planet of the Apes, Interstellar, they're move forward into the future, see what the future looks like kind of things.
Right.
That's a whole subgenre that is super fascinating. And I just don't want to spend this podcast talking about those, because I think that they're fascinating, but they're not what we think of when we think of time travel.
I think that's a really good way to frame it. And I think you just listed all the things that we're not talking about. I think, tell me if you would put this a different way, but I think the best way we can sort of positively talk about what we're doing today is we're talking about situations where our characters go backward in time to try to in some way change something so that the time that they go back to, that they started from is different, or to prevent it being different, or that in some way we're talking about that changing something from the past can affect something in the future or in the present.
Right. Or alternately, that they can move both directions in time, because normally you get to move forward. Everybody moves forward in time at 1 second per second, except for that one guy.
Yeah.
It's literally, there's one person who's like a millionth of a second younger than everybody else because he was in orbit for long enough.
Right.
But everybody else moves forward at 1 second per second, and you can imagine skipping forward faster, basically going into suspended animation. But the thing for plots for interesting science fiction is going backwards. The thing that you can never do. The stuff that is pure science fiction.
So what is it you like about that? What is it that really kind of draws you to time travel as a plot device in things that you enjoy?
So it gives the author a tool to address regret directly in a lot of ways. When you look at Quantum Leap, classic TV show, over the opening credits it goes, Sam Beckett goes to set right what once went wrong. Right? We've all done something bad. We've all done something terrible. We've all had mistakes and low points in our life. What if you could redo them? What if you could get a mulligan on, breaking up with your first girlfriend that you found out was really the best for you, right?
Right.
And what if you could go back and invest in Tesla stock or invest in Apple stock, right? Everybody has these, hey, I would go back and I would bet on, the Twins winning the World Series the year after they're at the bottom of the league, right? Infinite dollars, right? And so it gives authors this, what if you knew? What if you knew what you did wrong? Could you fix it?
Yeah.
Right? Like, oftentimes characters, you can write them in a straightforward setting where they're like, I know I'm doing something wrong and I'm doing it anyways, because that's superhuman, right? But what if you knew and did it anyways? Or what if you knew and found out that there was worse options? Or what if you knew and you found out that whatever you did didn't matter, actually? Right. And so it lets people address regret and failure and loss in ways that you can't do cleanly otherwise.
I think that's an interesting perspective to start on, because I think the general concepts you're talking about can be applied to a lot of the time travel we'll be talking today. But it seems in this moment you're talking about a fairly small subset of where it's about something you personally did. This isn't about, like what you just said, like isn't necessarily the same as like going back to kill Hitler or something like that. It's about, can you change a decision that you yourself made?
And going back to kill Hitler is a the big picture example of what you would do to try to save the 20th century, right? And the thing is that's making it a general problem, right? But really good stories are almost always personal problems,
right? And I think like Back to the Future, I mean I think we'll probably talk about that. It's maybe not the best example of time travel anyway, but it sort of always felt like there's a sense in which, if all you're doing is trying to figure out if 2 particular people do get married and 3 particular children do get born, that's a lot different than trying to change the course of world history.
Right.
And I feel like when it comes to plotting, I'm willing to have a much lower standard of logic when the consequences are so much less.
Right. And so we have a general section of, like, your questions are what works and what doesn't, or logical questions and moral questions. The logical questions, I'm actually going to jump to the types of time travel, and then we'll talk about how they address any kind of logic, because one of the fundamental things is that time travel doesn't work.
Yeah.
Right. There's some actual like physical implications to time travel that imply stuff that no time travel movie is ever going to take on, because one of the things is if you could send messages back to the past, that means you have infinite computing power.
Yeah.
So you really can't send anything that counts as coherent data back into the past. You can't. It's just not a thing. In theory, you could build mega-scale structures that could let you move backwards in time, but there's a funny Larry Niven story, which is a joke that I'll talk about later for that too. But so logically, it doesn't work. It's simply a plot device, right? Right. And the logical questions boil down to, there's 3 different types of time travel. Some things there's one timeline, there's one universe. Anything that you do changes history. Back to the Future that we talked about is exactly like that.
Right.
Star Trek is always like that too. Where, mostly true, because Star Trek's big and inconsistent.
Right.
But Back to the Future, you change the past, it affects the future. And one of the things about these kinds of movies or writings is it treats the viewpoint character as somehow special.
Right. That they're kind of outside of the consequences of these things.
Yes, or the consequences take time to impact them, or it comes up with some hand-wavy reason why changing the timeline would let that outside observer remain the way that they are.
Right. So in Back to the Future, the circumstances that are supposed to create Marty McFly no longer exist.
Yep.
But whatever controls time is going to take a while to wipe him out of existence, giving him a chance to fix it, whatever it is.
Right. And sometimes that's addressed as time propagates forward through time. Like it takes time for time to move forward, and it moves at a different rate or whatever. And so like Marty McFly slowly fades out as the changes propagate forward through history, right?
Right.
Even though he then travels forward into the future where it's already propagated. Back to the Future has no logical basis in anything of what it does.
Right.
But this lets you have the classic grandfather paradox. You go back in time and kill your grandfather before he married your grandmother. What happens to you?
Right.
Right. The classic, you did something and it changed things, and now your existence ceases to be.
Right.
And to
me, the next step of that paradox is, so if you no longer existed, how did you exist in order to go back and change the thing? And that's where we get into these, like, what I often refer to, the thing that I dislike most is the time travel paradox loop, where something in the future is what caused the thing in the past, and so, and we'll get to that, I think, with the next one you're going to talk about.
Right. So I have moral questions, but we'll swing back around and talk about those later. The other big logical branch is full predestination. Everything happens.
Right.
It happened. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy says that the moral stance that he takes is anything that happens.
Right.
And so from a predestination standpoint, and nothing changes. Any change that you make is already taken into account by the timeline, and in fact is mandatory. You cannot make any decisions that have not already been made.
And we say this is where a lot of those that logical time loop thing comes in, where the thing that happened in the past is because predestination already knows that in the future you're going to go back and try to change the thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And so Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure that you mentioned, I think, is one of the cleanest examples of a exact predestination plot. Every decision that Bill and Ted make over the course of the movie is mandatory.
Right.
There's no decision, and nobody actually makes any decisions over the course of the whole movie. In fact, they're capable of having a conversation with their past selves where they don't change anything, in part because they're idiots.
Right.
And
also very true.
Right. And so anything that they were going to say was scripted anyways, because you can totally predict, just knowing the characters, you could predict what they were going to say regardless. Right. They're not that complicated to model and have changes occur to. And they later in the movie they take advantage of this. They say, oh, anything that we will do has happened, so that means that we can steal my dad's keys and leave them here for me to find. Right. Because we know that his keys were stolen 2 days ago, and so we can take the keys and set them aside, and then pick up the keys.
The Bill and Ted conceit seems to be a really interesting way to do it, because to me, like, as they were saying that, I was just spotting logical fallacies every 3 words. But if you're dumb enough to not think of those logical fallacies, then it makes total sense. Like, it's a kind of brilliant way to think about it, where if you just look at it on the surface level, it makes total sense, and so you never have to question it.
Right. As soon as you're clever enough to figure out that you can poison your own future, you probably can't live in a paradox-free world like this, right? And so this deletes all paradoxes. A paradox will never happen. From a narrative perspective, these are incredibly difficult to write. You actually have to usually start with a bunch of planned events early on, write the whole thing, and then have your characters come back and redo it with their future knowledge, and then delete and rewrite most of your plot in multiple passes. There's a couple of books that by Charles Stross, Iron Sunrise and Singularity Sky, that involve super intelligent AIs that have time travel capability, basically having a war against each other, and you only see the end timeline. And he's like, I thought this is going to be a trilogy. I'm not smart enough to write the 3rd book. I'm sorry. I introduced a super intelligent AI in book 1 and a different evil one in book 2, and then there's consequences, and I'm not actually smart enough to write the 3rd book because I can't figure it out, because there's no paradoxes. There can't be paradoxes in this universe. It all already happened.
So to me, there's a couple questions this raises, and we'll go into it in more detail in a bit, but just to take the Bill and Ted thing, for example, one of the things that I thought was just raising so many paradoxes for me is not only do you have these two characters going back and changing things, but you are now giving fundamentally life-altering experiences to existing historical figures. And so is the idea that Napoleon has always gone to a water park named Waterloo, and maybe that's why he has positive associations and fights a battle there? I mean, is that the kind of thinking that
Yes.
goes into this? Okay.
Yeah, that's the conceit of the Bill and Ted universe is that all these historical figures had weird things happen to them. In fact, in the second movie is much looser about this.
Right.
But their conceit is that they could pick up these figures and then drop them back off, and they just tell them, "Feature's great, don't worry about it." And they also just lie to the historical figures, I assume.
Yeah.
Because if Abraham Lincoln says, "So we had a civil war, and you took me to San Dimas, California. That's super cool. So San Dimas with the North or with the South?" And you go, "See you later, Abraham Lincoln," right? He's like, does the North win? Like, are the Confederate States a functional nation afterwards? And you go, you win. Is that what makes him so confident that the North will triumph?
Yeah.
Right? If you tell Napoleon Waterloo is going to be a great time for you, then this Duke
of Winchester, that sounds like a good concession stand. It's fine.
Yeah, sure. And also they treat Napoleon really badly. Napoleon actually speaks 6 languages, including English.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
And so, like, their pastiches of historical characters are, in theory, once they pick up Napoleon, they can talk to anybody else that they pick up.
Yeah.
So, just like...
I'm not sure he speaks Mongol, but yes, I generally agree with what you're talking about.
Yeah. Also, Genghis Khan is the most successful human being in all of history, who also probably spoke multiple languages, but we don't have good documentation of all what he knew. But Genghis Khan is not some, like, loony idiot. He's like, Genghis Khan is a smart, tough warlord, right?
Well, and it's interesting the way you're saying that, because I think then this introduces... The reason we're talking about the different logical systems is so that we can have a larger conversation about what makes sense and what doesn't. And I feel like one of the things that becomes very important to me is that you're always thinking about what are the consequences of, to quote the old idea, every flap of the butterfly's wings.
Right.
And I like your idea here of the predestination idea is that Napoleon has always gone to this water park. That Genghis Khan has always beaten up the model. But then what you have to do is, I think you kind of drew this out with Abraham Lincoln, you have to make sure that you're now not giving them an experience which makes the actual historical record of what the character did make no more sense.
Right. I want to, before we go too deep into that, I want to talk about the third major type, which we finally have a really good example of in film fairly recently. So there's forking histories. Mm-hmm. So it treats the universe as a quantum universe. Any quantum change creates a forking history, right? And if you go back in time, you can deflect that into a different path, and you can change history, and it makes a whole new universe. Your universe stays. You could go back to it if you need to, and this universe starts from that point. Avengers Endgame makes use of this, where they're like, yeah, you don't change the timeline by going back in time. You make a different universe. The Infinity Stones, as long as they exist in the universe, make that universe real. Any other universe isn't real.
Right. So it's the idea of, like, you can take something from another timeline, but nothing that you do in the past will affect the future that you're in now. Yeah,
and nothing will affect your history.
Right.
And you can borrow things from the past, but it can't ever change anything about what has already happened to you. Any events that already happened that are in your experience path or in your experience cone can't be altered. That's just the way that they are. But you can go back in time to borrow things, which also implies that you can go forward to borrow things as well.
Right.
Which is something that they don't think about in Avengers Endgame. The question is, why didn't they go to the future and pick up the Infinity Stones? Or why didn't they go to the far future and get a better list of when the Infinity Stones all were?
Yeah.
Right? They had plenty of opportunities to get them, but they're panicked and not, like...
Well, I think this is a basic problem with any kind of time travel is it's the omnipotence problem. Time travel is so fundamentally powerful that once you have created it, kind of like how in Star Trek, like they give them incredible powers, and then most of the plots are based on some particular power breaking, so they don't have the easy thing to fix the plot.
Right.
In Bill and Ted's, I thought it was funny that they just artificially, with no logical explanation, say that Bill and Ted are under time pressure. Because the idea that they're under time pressure in a time machine makes no logical sense whatsoever. And if they're not, then they have the. I mean, theoretically, they could actually go spend 20 years studying history, becoming perfect historians, and then pass the test that way. But they just create this artificial plot device to take that off the table.
They create this plot device that they actually hold to in the third movie, but they don't hold to in the second, which is that as their time advances, the time they come from advances. That they can't ever, that they have a track of their timeline, and any time that they take matches up to what happens in their timeline.
Okay, that I guess kind of makes sense.
And so they say, remember, for every minute that passes on your watch, a minute passes in San Dimas, because as they advance forward, their time advances forward, which doesn't. They then seconds later definitely disprove because they loop back on themselves.
Right.
But that's the one thing that they do clumsily because they wanted them to meet themselves from a plot perspective.
Right.
The other logical problem with almost all with the full predestination is humans are sloppy and clumsy and fuzzy about how we handle brains and thoughts. And so the full predestination path implies that the quantum universe doesn't exist.
Right.
Because like nothing ever happens the same way twice.
Right. It's this idea. It totally ignores any of the butterfly ideas. You know, it's the idea that like, and to me, there's also another question. I want to, in a minute, go back to like just a more general conversation about all of these, but specific to predestination. For me, from a theological standpoint, when I hear that term, I think of it specifically in theological terms, because that's one of the most frequent uses of it. It's this idea that God has predestined everything that will happen. Right. And then there's all these questions that come up of like, is there any such thing as a sinner, or like a good or bad person, if God has already decided who will be and who won't be sinners? You know, and then there's this whole school of theology that gets locked into like people just having these existential crises of, am I actually a good person, or am I just trying to fake being, you know, all that stuff. And granted, I think you can have the idea of predestination without any of that. But does the concept of predestination to some extent imply the existence of someone who has set that predestination? Whether it is like a being or just a force in the universe, or is there some sort of agency at work here?
Yeah, what it implies is the Copenhagen interpretation. I don't know how much of a physics geek you are.
Not at all. So, in as layman's term as possible, explain that.
So there's two types of views of the universe. There's the classical universe, which is Newton's universe, which is everything is set up, it's clockwork. There is no actual absolute randomness. The stars in their courses, the orbits of the planets don't have any variation. The Copenhagen interpretation is that even down to the most fundamental level, everything is knowable and understandable and is set. You can know exactly where and how fast an electron's going. Every piece of matter you can have perfect knowledge about everything.
Right.
Then there is the quantum view of the universe, which is that some things are weird. So when I was talking about how nothing ever happens the same way twice, Schrodinger's cat is the classic thought experiment for this on a macro level, right? Which is you can't actually tell if a radioisotope is going to decay during a period of time. It has a 50-50 chance to do so, and that's absolute. That's not actually predictable classically. And so you can't Heisenberg's uncertainty principle says that if you measure the speed of an electron, you lose its position.
Right.
If you measure the position, you lose its speed. There's math and weirdness up there, but basically you can't get both sets of data at the same time. Measuring one changes the other.
Right.
And it changes it into something that you can't know. The universe is fundamentally quantum. It's also fundamentally classical. It's both things at the same time. And it's totally fucking weird. Sorry.
Right.
Because have you heard of the double slit experiment?
No.
Okay. So this is one of the coolest and strangest results in physics. You have a photon of light. That's a discrete unit of energy, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can send one photon through a slit, and it'll get so you have a vertical slit, and so when you look at, say, a slit and you have a light source above it, you get a spread out underneath it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you have like a cone of light coming out of this slit of light. So you can send one photon at a time, though. It's possible to ship out one photon, and that'll go out, and those will form a cone, a probability distribution across the cone, right?
Right.
That's simple, straightforward. That happens in any interpretation, in classical or quantum interpretation. It's just like it moves a little bit. Like you could predict it classically for any given one, but in the quantum, you can't predict it. But the double slit experiment, you take two slits and put them next to each other, and light, if it's a wave, would interfere with itself, like sound waves interfere, right?
Right.
Or when you view two waves on the surface of a pond. If it's a wave, that's the quantum interpretation. Instead of it being a particle, which is absolutely predictable,
Mm-hmm.
waves will interfere with themselves.
Right.
So if you pass it through two slits, you should get interference patterns. You do, but only when you observe it.
Of course.
It's.
I mean, everything you're. I maybe that I'm not sciencey enough to understand. Everything you're saying seems to argue against any concept of a predestination universe. But I'm more asking about, if we accept predestination, does that imply there has to be a destiner?
That implies that it implies you probably can't know. It implies the universe was set in its course. It's you could make the theist argument that whatever set it in motion we can't know or understand.
Right.
Something set it in motion could be. It doesn't necessarily need to be an omniscient or an omnipotent God.
Right.
Right. It's
so I said it could be a force. It could be a group.
Right.
It could be anything. You know.
Right. It could be a mathematical, argument. It could be like anything that's outside the bounds of the universe. The universe is a closed system. Knowing anything outside of that closed system is fundamentally unknowable. So
right.
Whatever, just give up. Like, you can't know it, you can't test it, you can't measure it. It is anything that you can say about the universe can be asserted without evidence, so it can be dismissed without evidence, right? And so it's possible to have time travel and predestination that's based on the universe as a clockwork mechanism without
mm-hmm.
any implication about a creator.
A clock maker, yeah.
Right, without a clock maker. And so that it's very possible to say, well, in a predestination universe, in a universe where everything happened already,
right,
that there has to be something that set it in motion and said, this is the absolute shape of it.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting way to phrase it. Sorry, go ahead.
Have I read stories like that? I'm thinking if there's most science fiction stories end up at most religious agnostic.
Right.
Like sometimes they don't try to address the problem of an omnipotent or omniscient God unless they're specifically going out to talk about religion. Right. And then they're usually allegorical in some way.
Right. Yeah, and I think I'm more bringing it up because I think it's an interesting thing that science fiction, I think in part because it is on some level a fundamentally the question of who has created this thing that is to be destined is itself a theological question. And for obvious reasons, I think, as you just said, science fiction generally doesn't, dive into that unless it wants to very specifically. But I ask it because I do think that a lot of times the way we talk about it and the way even characters will talk about it, it becomes very interesting, especially when we'll get to this more in the morality questions. But once you're starting to get into the question of, is this timeline right? And I don't mean right in terms of like what originally happened, but is it like morally correct or should it be better? Then a lot of times I think part of what that gets into is who decided that this all should be how it is, and all the questions of like, well, but this is the whole time cop question.
Yep.
Once you have someone saying what time is what it should be, the next question is, well, why? And is there it often feels like the argument of a time cop assumes that there is some intelligence, and maybe it's just the intelligence of a clock without a clock maker, but that there's some sort of fundamental rightness about time playing out the way it did without interference. I guess that's maybe why the question is so interesting to me.
Right. And a lot of the time, the time cops, so like there's a movie Time Cop, obviously. I think that the first real example of time police is probably Time Patrol by Paul Anderson. I could look and see if there was an earlier example, but he wrote several works based on a time patrol that goes back and fixes problems. People from the future get access to time machines and go back, and the time patrol goes back and fixes their crap, basically. Takes it away because they were illegally operating it.
Yeah.
But their moral basis is fundamentally, you can't change anything that would delete the existence of the time cops. They are okay. And anything that would change the history to the point where the time cops don't exist, they don't allow. That's it. They're like, for the most part, like small changes back in history, you go back and you kidnap a peasant in the year 1312. In most time cop driven universes, time is elastic enough to absorb small changes.
Right.
But the time cops, morally, the only thing they care about is keeping their own history secure for the most part.
Right.
And then they of course have moral quandaries where somebody's like, well, why don't you go kill Hitler? And they're like, we genuinely don't know what would happen if we killed Hitler in 1929. Right.
The episode of Superhero Ethics that will come out is not yet published, but will come out immediately before this one. One of the things we talked about is, I think, actually very relevant to this, because it's the whole idea of the difference between one evil person versus an evil system. And Hitler, to me, is a great example. Like, a lot of time travel is based on, you go back in time, you kill Hitler, everything's better now. Which ignores the fact that, like, the Nazi Party just puts Himmler in place, or whatever it is.
Right. There's all sorts of, there's places where killing Hitler would make time worse. Right. Like, if you killed Hitler in between his rise to power and and when he decided to irrationally attack the USSR, time gets real weird. Yeah. Right.
Maybe Germany wins that war, or maybe just he becomes a martyr and the neo-Nazi movement in Germany is much stronger now, or whatever it is.
Right.
Good.
And so the thing with time cops is that, like, if you actually sit down and think about them, they're morally null in a lot of cases. They're just like, all I'm doing is protecting my own existence. They're the same as using lethal force to defend yourself against a lethal attacker in a lot of circumstances. They're just like, yes, this is fine. This is morally acceptable in basically most moral codes of the world.
Right. I think that's the conceit often, but I certainly think you do get stories where part of the point of the story is that the time cops are not accounting. They think they're being morally null, but they're not accounting for their own bias in some way or another.
And they also, this gets brought up in a bunch of them. One of the best, basically time police kind of stories is The End of Eternity by Isaac Asimov, where he has this fundamental question that he never comes out and asks, but he has the main character wrestle with the implications of, which is, if you can change history and you can improve it, are you obligated to do so?
Yeah, that's a really important question.
Because their time control group has this span of time that they cover, and they're like, a lot of the time they make decisions just so that it's easier for them to manage the timeline.
Right.
And they fundamentally don't care if, an extra million people die here or there, because if it makes it easier for them to not have to deal with whatever result happens another millennia down the line, they'll make the choice that makes it more stable and easier for them to deal with.
So that's a great morality question, and we'll get to that. I want to just step back, though. You did a great job of laying out the three logical systems, and I think this is a great time to start discussing the logical problems, because I think for myself and many people, this is where time travel becomes a hard thing to watch, is when it feels logically inconsistent. And the way you framed it, I think, is very helpful, and tell me if you would agree with this. It feels to me like a lot of times when time travel becomes logically problematic, in the sort of superhero world of, we accept the general conceit, even though the general conceit doesn't make any sense, but the arc reactor is real, Aquaman exists, now let's go into the logic. It feels like a lot of times bad time travel is where the writers are getting mixed up the single changeable timeline and full predestination. Because they're, to some extent, having all these time loops possible, but also allowing people to change the time loops. Is that, you think, a fair description?
Yeah. That's where the writers didn't sit down and have a full concept of what the implications of whatever system are.
Right.
Exactly. And so you talked about Umbrella Academy. I just finished the last 2 episodes of Umbrella Academy yesterday. And Umbrella Academy is not designed to have a good plot.
Yeah. I think it's a fair way of putting it.
Even without time travel, even if you took all the time travel episodes and deleted them, Umbrella Academy is a bunch of idiot characters acting in dumb ways that are true to themselves.
Yeah.
Which is why I like it. It's a very community kind of thing where, you can be an idiot as long as you're true to your character, and I don't care.
Yeah, to me it's much more about the psychological effects of being raised to be superheroes. Like that's what it cares about.
Right. They do a lot of what is called rule of cool, which is if it's neat that they should be able to do it, they do it. The powers of the different characters mutate and change over time. So they have different capabilities at different times. It's not set out to where they always can do this thing, they always can do that thing. They have a general like Klaus deals with the dead. What does that mean in any given circumstance?
Yeah, it means I think that rule of cool makes total sense.
And so that leads to the sloppy time travel where some stuff is predestined, some stuff isn't predestined. Time loops snip out pieces of history and change the future without real regard for stuff. The viewpoints of the characters are special,
right?
And so the characters of whoever is time traveling are a special viewpoint, and that special viewpoint, the time will change around them, but they'll remain constant, right? And that inherent specialness of their viewpoint doesn't work very well plot-wise in Umbrella Academy because it's handled really clumsily.
Right.
That's because they talk about, you need to do this so that this happens, so that this other thing happens. They have bits where they have where they go like how spoilery are we allowed to be in this? Can we spoil everything for Umbrella Academy?
I think I would just say now, this podcast can spoil everything from Umbrella Academy, everything from Star Trek, pretty much, but especially the episode City on the Edge of Forever, but also a lot of the movies and stuff like that.
Yep.
But yeah, so that, Star Trek, all the Back to the Future movies, all the Avenger movies, we're generally spoiling those things.
Yep. So there's a bit where they there's an initial time portal that opens very early in the show, and near the end of season 2 they open that time portal, that exact same one, and something comes through from the past of the show, and a fire extinguisher that gets thrown early in the show comes through as a payoff plot wise, and it hits another character,
right? Which
tells you this is the same portal, but they've given information to a character they're going to send through the portal that character didn't have. They talked a big game about you can't kill him because then the other guy would cease to exist, who's 14 days older, so you must kill the newer one if you're going to kill one of the two, right?
Right.
And I'm like, that doesn't track at all.
Yeah.
Once you show up and talk to him, you've screwed up your future, right?
Well, and I will say, I did like, a lot of the time travel in Umbrella Academy does drive me batty, and hearing sort of the time travel expert that I'm now anointing you for, because you've read a lot about it, agree with that does help me a lot. But I do think that one of the things that I like about Umbrella Academy is it really gets to the idea that anybody having an objective understanding of time travel, logic, or morality is wrong. Like that, the time cops who are presented to us as sort of being, that what you said, no morality, it turns out have just as much of an agenda as anyone else,
Yes.
And that everyone's when the two fives are arguing about what is, the right thing to do for the timeline, it's more because neither one of them wants to die, but also because they're having the psychosis set in, and it's, right. I at least appreciate that for sure.
Right. And so the thing with Umbrella Academy is that, like, there's also just implications they don't go into with the way that their universe is set up. They have this commission that edits time to be the way that they want it to be, which has to be the way the commission comes to exist, right?
Right.
Like if you argue that there's any kind of paradox in their universe, all they're doing is controlling their own initial existence and making sure that it happens.
Right.
But that implies that somebody else is trying to alter it, that other people are changing the timeline, because it doesn't just happen on its own, right? They aren't trying to bonsai a new timeline to do a particular thing. They tell them this is the thing that must happen, this is what happens. And it's always happened. But then about midway through, you find out that that's not the case, and they have no idea what they're talking about, and none of them remember history at all. Oh, John F. Kennedy got killed? That didn't happen. And I'm like, point of order. You're talking to somebody who knows for sure JFK got killed.
Right.
Right?
Well, and I think the JFK assassination moment in Umbrella Academy is a perfect example of this, because one of the things I think that always drives me the most crazy about this is when it's when some consequences matter and some don't, specifically for plot reasons. Your own brain starts to think, well, wait a minute, why is that true? You know, and so, for example, in the version of history that we saw, yes, there was no actual attempt to assassinate JFK. Instead, the police building that was like close to the route was blown up, and all the police who were killed, who were, by the way, investigating what they thought of as a communist spy. Wouldn't that also create the
building didn't get blown up, just everyone inside died.
Okay.
If the building gets blown up, then they start a nuclear war. They had to save the building from being blown up.
Right.
They just had to kill everyone inside. Right. It doesn't make any sense.
But yeah,
Somebody kills a whole building full of FBI agents and you don't...
While investigating a Russian spy, wouldn't that create just as much of the Russians are behind this kind of thing? Yeah.
Right. It would, but we were 10 minutes from midnight multiple times in the 1960s.
Yeah.
When I was sitting down to watch it, and my wife goes, 1962? What's so bad about 1962? And I'm like, the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Yeah.
Like, that's going to end they have a dozen ways to end the world that year. It's not that hard, right? And so they're...
Well, yeah, I think in part what we're getting at here is that there's kind of two different levels of logical questions. One is the logic of the actual time travel itself and, like, timelines. But the other thing is the logic of, can you go back and do something and then be able to predict the results that will or won't have? And in some ways, almost the second one is even more logically inconsistent in my mind many times.
Right. The predictability. So the one of the classic time travel stories that everybody refers to, and you've referred to it multiple times, and you probably don't even necessarily know. I don't know if you've even read it. It's A Sound of Thunder by Ray Bradbury.
Never heard of
it. The phrase "the butterfly effect" comes specifically from A Sound of Thunder.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And so it is. They're going back and they're doing hunting trips to the Paleolithic. And they're hunting a Tyrannosaurus Rex, and they have hover platforms that stay off the ground, and they get warned, don't touch or impact anything except the T-Rex that you are going to kill. You have a specific time to kill it. It was going to be hit by a falling tree 10 seconds after you're due to kill it, so you won't really impact anything. It was going to die in the next 10 seconds anyways, but you get to say you shot a T-Rex.
Right.
And so they head back to the safari. A person steps off of the hover path and steps on a butterfly. And when they go back to the future, the language has shifted a little bit. The vowel sounds are different, and a different person is winning the presidential race.
Interesting. So a tiny change caused a small change, but still a significant one.
Right, but a fundamentally unpredictable one.
Yeah.
And so they were like, oh no. And they were thinking, like, can we go back and fix that? We can't undo that, right? And so that's the phrase, the butterfly effect, comes specifically from A Sound of Thunder by Ray Bradbury.
Right.
And it a lot of science fiction authors agree with you that fundamentally, once you poke the system, you don't know what's going to come out. Everything's too complex. And there's a bunch of Mugwump 5, I think is a good one, by Murray Leisner. They talk about changing the timeline. They have like levels of perturbation. Like they change one letter in a phone book, and that changes the path of the U.S. from an or away nuclear war. Right. And so that's how large of an impact can you create from how small of a change?
Right.
Is the conceit of that story, where there's outside of time aliens playing with things.
And I think part of what you're actually helping me also come to terms with sound far too significant. I just mean like better understand. I think the kind of time travel I like least, and Umbrella Academy falls into this, and probably why I had such strong feelings about it, is where it is time travel of our heroes have either accidentally or intentionally gone back, but they have done something they did not mean to do. And now everything they're trying to do is an attempt to fix that first mistake, to unkill that first butterfly. in the terms you're talking about. And that's where it just feels like the logical fallacies just compound upon each other more and more and more.
They do, but that's what I'm talking about, is that the stories are usually ones of regret and undoing mistakes, right? Because even with the time travel, they knew about a mistake, they tried to fix it, and they failed to fix the mistake. You can tell these as a straightforward story, you know, boy and girl get together, boy and girl spend some time together, boy does something stupid, loses girl, realizes that he should make up, goes to make up with the girl and makes it worse, right? That's the same story, right? Just with the extra time travel nonsense added in.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean, is that most of the stories are stories of regret and trying to correct mistakes and failure.
Yeah, I think it's very true. And I think another thing that comes up for me about this is I kind of wish we would get more stories that are purely the full predestination. But I think the problem is, if you tell us that that's the time travel universe we're working in, then there's absolutely no tension. You know, if Rufus starts Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure by saying, don't worry about it, what I'm going to do to get them to do the things that they're going to do, to get the teacher to do the thing that he's going to do, to get the father to do the thing, all that's already been decided. So there's no consequence or stakes to anything you're about to see. Now, like, for that movie to make, I mean, mostly it's just a bunch of dumb jokes, but for there to be any tension in the movie, you have to believe there's a possibility that it doesn't work out. And if I'm understanding you correctly, that is actually a false understanding by the characters and thus the audience, because the movie is actually saying nothing you're about to see is in any way up to, that it's basically Candyland. Everything's been predetermined. There's no tension whatsoever.
The way that I've seen this avoided most elegantly, because it like that is a problem with predestination. It can be avoided by having two types of characters that you care about. So you've seen the Doctor Who episode Blink?
I have not.
Oh, it might be the best episode of the New Who.
Okay.
It only has a couple of conceivable contenders.
I may well have seen it but forgotten it. So give a 20-second explanation.
The brief explanation is that there are these. The show almost does not have the Doctor in it at all. It follows a character that it deliberately makes you attached to. She is getting messages. Well, one message from the Doctor. She is watching a recorded video.
Oh yes, I think I did see this one.
And it demonstrates like all of her decisions have been pre-made to the point where she reads a script he has a scripted side of the conversation. She has a conversation and he's a video recording, and they have a conversation, right? And it demonstrates this predestination version of time travel very, very well. And you realize the Doctor is guaranteed to survive this at the end. Yeah. There's no tension for him. Everything's going to work out for him, and you know it is.
Right.
But everything might not work out for her.
And so thus making us care so much more about her matters so much more.
Right. Because once after she pays it off and sends his time machine back to him in the past, because the villains are these angels that when they touch you, they eat your history and send you into the past. And so one of her friends gets sent back to the year 1912, right? Or whatever. And then so you realize after she pays off the time machine, they're surrounded by these angels, and it's possible that they could just get screwed, right, by the Doctor at the end of it. And there's all these circumstances where she could get screwed, and all the characters could lose, but the notes get found by somebody else and sent back. You don't know.
Oh,
right?
I like that. Yeah.
And so, fundamentally, there's this tension of she's being threatened by the angels, and because they send people back in time, they could actually send her back in time, and then she sends another note forward to the Doctor who's in between. Yeah. And so, there's possibilities that her life could end up hosed. She's not going to die. The angels don't kill you. And so the tension is basically she's going to lose her life. All the trappings of the world around her. Are they going to get torn away from her family, her friends, right? Right. But Doctor Who is an example of the time travel doesn't make any sense, is horrifically inconsistent, and it doesn't matter because the time travel is a vehicle for other plots.
And I think that becomes one of the key things is there's an extent to which, and this is true I think for any kind of pseudoscience or pseudo magic or things like that, the more I care about it is the more that the writers care about it. So in Back to the Future, it is not a serious movie. It is a comedy. It is ridiculous. It is meant to be silly. And so I'm happy to be like, who the hell cares what the flux capacitor does? Let's go watch, them, play B.B. King 20 years before anyone's ever heard of it. Love that. I'm sorry, Chuck Berry, not B.B. King.
Well, there's problems with the Chuck Berry scene.
Well,
but...
sure, but yeah, oh yeah, actually, because it is another time loop of this is why Chuck Berry learns to play because a white kid teaches him, which is another huge problem. But
you figured out my problem with it.
Yeah,
which is that white dudes don't teach black dudes to play soul music.
Yeah.
It's just not...
God, I have this horrible image now of someone writing a story where Vanilla Ice goes back in time to invent rap or something horrible like that. Really racist.
Well, it isn't. Whatever.
Yeah, but my point being that I feel like the less you ask me to care about it. Same with Quantum Leap. Quantum Leap. It's great stories. It's fantastic acting. And it's all small little stories. But the more that you like in Umbrella Academy, the characters are trying to in Umbrella Academy and in Endgame. The characters are trying to decide what does or doesn't make sense for time travel. So I feel like now you've asked me to care about it, and that's where I'm going to have. Right. And that's why I think Endgame passes the bar, but Umbrella Academy doesn't because you've set the bar so much higher. Right. And part of what I think this is also getting at is that of the three methods you talk about, I think predestination, if any of them make sense, predestination makes the most logical sense because there's now, as you said, there's no possibility of paradox. It's also narratively the most boring, as we just talked about. And so, as time travel writers, the fundamental, like your own paradox is, how do you keep it logically consistent when, every step towards logical consistency probably makes it a more boring story. And every step away from logical consistency gives the characters more agency and thus makes it a more interesting story.
Because that's the thing, is agency, right?
Right.
If the characters don't have any choices, then, like you said, there's no consequences to anything. You know that at the end of the movie, they all die. Right. It doesn't matter. It's just fundamentally everybody dies at the end of life.
Right.
But that the payoff at the end of the movie, they show you the final scene, and in the final scene they're all corpses on the floor, and you're like, well, I guess it might be interesting how we get there. Right. If you knew the end of Reservoir Dogs at the beginning of Reservoir Dogs, it actually would probably make Reservoir Dogs a better movie. I don't know. That's weird.
I mean, I think Reservoir Dogs is definitely one where it works better the second time for exactly the reasons you're talking about. Yeah.
Right. I was like, well, Reservoir Dogs is one where everybody dies. Let's use that as an example. Wait, that was better the second. Dang it. Okay. But so then you're worried about how you get to that point, right? Which is the other way to really lean on time travel is have somebody see an outcome.
Right.
And then basically get involved with things that unfold to that outcome point, which is the eventual payoff in Umbrella Academy, which is the assassination of Kennedy happens, and they're all involved, right, in some way. Except for the fact that then they screw themselves by becoming, public enemy number one in the year 1963.
Right.
But a lot of the times a character will be like, well, I don't know why it had to lead to this consequence. And then they ride along and they realize that their decisions don't actually matter.
Right.
Or they make the decisions and it lines everything up anyways. And you realize that at the end you're like, well, I guess everything was irrelevant.
And that can be a powerful story of the lack of agency. But I think you as the writer have to know that. You have to help the audience come to terms with it at the same time the characters are coming to terms with it.
Right. And it's easier in smaller stories. So there aren't a lot of big, long epics that involve time travel a lot.
Yeah.
Right?
Because the further you go along, the more those little things, they grow comprehensively. They compound is what I'm looking for.
They compound and they get worse and worse. And prophecy has the advantage of being muddy. And so, if you're reading a book where prophecies happen, the Sibyl gives you an accurate prophecy, and you know that the future will have this thing come to terms, but it's deliberately slightly vague, right? Your son will kill you and marry your wife, or marry his mother, right? And so you know that this prophecy will happen, but it's very deliberately vague about exactly how this comes to pass, and so whatever actions you take eventually loop back to that point,
right?
Which that's fundamentally a precognition story.
Yeah.
And that works much better in longer novels or longer works.
Yeah.
The Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan and then Brandon Sanderson. There's a bunch of prophecies fairly early on, like in the first 3 books, there's a point where somebody asks questions of what amounts to a sibyl. They get a whole pile of prophecies, including stuff that they just genuinely don't understand. They're like, you're going to meet somebody from this nation, they're going to be this nation's queen, and you're going to marry that person. And they're like, I've never heard of this nation at all. And so the author is actually pretty free to do whatever, right? As long as they bend the plot to this one particular point, which could be a faked up point of like, look, we need to be married for this legal reason, but then we're going to part ways and never see each other again, right? It could be anything. And so prophecy's easier to do as a longer term thing, and it doesn't lead to as many moral issues, right? And so like there's so many. If you can change history, and this is the question that I asked earlier, if you can edit history, are you obligated to make history better?
Yeah, so I think this is a good time to move into the moral questions.
Yeah.
So I think that, and let's start with that one. Like, what's your take on, if you have the ability to change history to make it better, should you?
So leaving history the same has to be morally null, right? Because it's protecting your own existence, which is always considered to be an acceptable moral thing to do.
I would disagree with that, but I'll accept that for the sake of your argument. So go ahead.
In most moral viewpoints, existing is neutral.
Right.
And so you don't have to. I am not obligated to go donate all my money to water charities in Africa. It would be a net positive thing for me to do, right? Well, for more people, but I'm not obligated to do so. I could just keep my own existence fine on a neutral keel.
I think this gets into a great question of one of the shows we talked about. So I'd actually let us actually talk about this for a minute more, and then let you finish the point you're talking about. Because I wonder, what if part of the time travel is that when it's the character who learns that their survival actually caused the problem. So, for example, in City at the Edge of Forever in Star Trek, well, the main, for those who haven't seen that show episode or haven't seen it in a long time, the crux of the story is that there's this really good sort of social worker type person who lives in New York that in the way history originally played out, that she dies in 1930. And so Dr. McCoy winds up going back in time, and we later find out he saved her from the car crash that killed her. The problem is that if she lives, she goes on to start a huge pacifist movement, which makes it even harder for FDR to get the United States into World War II, and Germany invents the atom bomb first, and so Germany wins World War II. Now, the moral question there is, and we'll get to this one, the other characters, do they or don't they save her life? But what if she finds this out? Because this is when I would sort of push back, because I would say, if she knows that if she works to continue her life, she will likely cause this horrible thing to happen. And maybe she could change her actions and not be a pacifist, but if you just take that part of the conceit, isn't that then a case where actually there is a moral question of your survival may not be morally null?
Right. So you can remove time travel from the equation, right? You can make it a dynastic issue with royalty, for instance.
Right.
I am a prince. If I commit suicide, then it removes my son, who is a real right bastard and wants to kill a bunch of people from the line, because the rules are if somebody commits suicide, their whole line is removed from succession.
Right.
Right. And it would switch it over to the other side of the family, and the other side of the family has a whole bunch of like excellent people who would be really great rulers. So I know that morally, I need to remove my line from succession, and the most straightforward way for me to do that is to openly commit suicide or commit treason or something like that, right? Suicide in many moral systems is morally bad, right?
I mean, in Endgame, both Natasha and Tony Stark basically do the kind of thing you're talking about. They kill themselves for a larger purpose.
Right, exactly. And you could like, they are doing it actively as part of a like trading their life for a thing. Like this is just like I just hang myself in a closet kind of thing, right? Which is, I would argue that suicide is generally morally bad. So
that'll be another ethical issue. I disagree with you there, but I totally get it. To get back to your original point.
Yeah. To my original point, you can remove time travel from the equation. You can write plots that don't involve this at all. So then the question is whether or not that, like, committing suicide is good or bad.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that time travel changes, the one thing it changes is, so in City on the Edge of Forever, it's Spock acts kind of emotional about the whole situation a little bit, which is weird. Edith Keeler's been dead for 4 centuries. Right?
So he should just sort of logically understand it, that this isn't a tragedy. We're seeing that, because in some ways, Kirk and McCoy, they have that I now have a human connection to this person, and so now their death matters more to me than it would have if this was just a historical footnote. Spock should be able to say, my connection to a person doesn't make their death any more or less morally significant, but he doesn't in some ways.
Right. And so, like, this happens in the real world, too. When you watch Hamilton and, any of the major characters in Hamilton die, it's structured to make you feel it, right? And so when Hamilton dies in Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton has been dead for 200 and some odd years, right?
Right.
And so, like, realistically, why should I care about Alexander Hamilton dying? Why should I care about any of that, right? It's a historical drama. I shouldn't get all weepy at his death songs. But we're humans, and we make this human connection to this thing, right?
Right.
And so it makes sense that the emotional center of the show, McCoy, and the decider section of the show, Kirk, should get emotionally invested in the situation.
Right.
Spock should just say, "Dude's like, she's been dead for multiple centuries.
Yeah.
Like, she's a figure in a book, guys.
Right.
Can we go?"
Well, and I think to get back to the main kind of question we were talking about, that I think Sitting on the Edge of Forever is such a great example of. Like here, this seems to be an example of you go back and you don't change history, you undo the change that you did to history in order that, a small tragedy can happen so that a ginormously different, much larger tragedy doesn't happen. I think to me the main moral question here is, because you're right, like the question is like, should you do that if you can? The problem is, I feel like that this is kind of Godwin's law in action, because the problem I have is who gets to decide what the right history should be. And once you get Nazis involved, Godwin's law, it's pretty easy for us to say like Nazi bad. But what if this was about like communist China? Like communist China, like should they or shouldn't they have won the Chinese Civil War? Mao did horrible, horrible, horrible things. But
the Great Leap Forward is one of the biggest mass murders in history, right? Like,
right. But would Chiang Kai-shek have been any better? Like, or what? Right. Where is China now compared to what it was 100 years ago or 80 years ago? Like, so I guess that's to me that's my counter to this question of if we're going to say that there's some morality to going back in time to fix history, doesn't that bring up the problem of who gets to decide what is the best version of history?
Right, exactly. Like the question that always gets asked is, let's pretend that you find out that despite everything terrible that happens in World War II, the next generation of leaders after the Nazis realize how bad it was, turn everything around, and turn the world into utopia by the year 2020.
Right.
Right? Like, now where's your trade-off?
Yeah.
What level of good and what level of bad do you balance? Or if you're purely utilitarian about it, you'll make lots of these, like, what I should probably do is say, go back to the first group of hominids that count as human, and then start building a good society from them, right? And that is the most history altering that you can do for the greater good, right?
Right.
Because that deletes 1 trillion people.
I think it's an interesting question as well, because, and this is where I think the subjective part comes in, a lot of times it's, I want to stop the great evil that I don't think I benefit from, and that I also feel like I can see as an objective evil. So, for example, I'm going to go back and kill Hitler. Great, but in pure numeric terms, you probably save as many lives, if not more, if you go back and kill Christopher Columbus. Or, in some other way stop colonialism. But
or you go back in time and you give Semmelweis the actual underpinnings of the germ theory of disease.
Right.
Like, holy cow. If Semmelweis could have proved his case to the world, then you would probably save on the order of 10 billion people's lives, right? Like the it's really difficult and big because your pivots are so large, right? But then are you responsible to all the people that this uncreates? Which is the forking histories issue. If you create a whole universe by going back and making a forking history, are you responsible for the bad things that happen in that universe too?
Yeah, I think, and amazing. It all comes down to consequences. You know what's the morality of your consequences, and
yeah, are you a consequentialist?
Right.
Like, do you believe that all outcomes from your decision are within your cone of consequences? Right.
Right.
So that leads to all sorts of problems with time travel, because you get to the other thing that time travel does as a plot is it lets you see long-term results of your actions.
Right.
And it lets you see, well, I went back in time and I killed Hitler, and it turns out that historical inevitability wins the day, and it was just Himmler in charge instead, and he was less irrational, and he didn't attack the USSR, and it made things a lot worse, right? The war took an extra 5 years, and we dropped nukes on half of Europe.
I think the point of consequence becomes so important because it also makes me realize, I think one of the things that will change how I feel about the morality of time travel is if you make me believe that the people somehow know every possible consequence, and in Umbrella Academy they kind of imply this, but it doesn't actually seem to happen. But I think there's certainly other time travel stories where the time cops or whoever, the person who at the end is making the decision about what time should or shouldn't be changed, has some ability to know the effect of every butterfly, and so they can say, like, yes, you can go back and kill this person, but if you go back and do this thing, then this terrible result will happen. Yeah. But the existence of that is pretty hard to surmise. And if it doesn't exist, then I think because we have no idea what the consequences are, it becomes much harder morally to justify.
Mm-hmm. It becomes super muddy.
Yeah.
And the greater good arguments end up getting into weird places in some of these shows. So Travelers is a really good time travel show, right? And have you seen Travelers?
I have not.
Okay. The high level thing is that time travel is actually a discrete one directional data sense. So a traveler is basically quantum leaped into a person's body, erases the person that's there, and is replaced with their personality, and that's one and done. Mm-hmm. They can never go back. And the other thing is that underdeveloped brains, the supercomputer in the future, can send messages via children's brains.
Right.
Because their brains aren't developed enough and so it can very temporarily take over the child, give a short message, and then let the child loose. So that a traveler will be sent back, and they send back a team that has a specific set of skills, which is actually like really sensible and makes the show work.
Right.
And the team is told, your mission is to do this set of objectives that's sent to you by the supercomputer in the future. The supercomputer's objective is to undo this big giant catastrophe, an asteroid striking the Earth.
Okay.
And that's all the computer wants to do. It'll end up deleting its own existence. It morally believes that this is correct. It saves an unbelievable number of lives, and it's a tragedy that isn't caused by people, and so it's not a big moral quandary on do you right. in 1927 do you preemptively invade Germany, right?
Right.
There's
no political side in favor of the asteroid. You're not right. Taking sides in history.
Right. In fact, it's pretty clear. An asteroid striking the Earth is bad. If you can prevent it, you probably should.
Right.
Great. It's an impersonal tragedy. And the thing that happens in Travelers is they find out that their actions on their way to saving the world from this asteroid subtly screw up the small group of survivors that are in the future.
Yeah, that's an interesting one.
And that's one of the side plot things that happens is they find out that they start getting people back from the future that remember a different future from them.
Right.
And so they're like, well, we're making some of these things quantitatively worse, but we're going to delete everything that leads to our existence for the most part. Like they morally, they're like, well, we care a little bit, but not actually as much as you might think, because the end goal is to delete like 200 years of history, right?
Right.
And so they, but they have this structural problem of the show, like it needs an antagonist.
Yeah.
And so they have a different traveler that, abandoned the whole traveler agenda and has decided to set himself up as emperor of the world.
Interesting.
Basically. But the show is really good.
Yeah. It's one I've heard good things about before, and this concept of time travel is one I think I'd really enjoy seeing.
Right.
Especially because it seems like this is going for a much broader picture than you often get.
Yeah.
I think, and this is kind of maybe my last sort of big problem with time travel is, and this is a problem I have with a lot of superhero media and stuff like that, is it buys into, what I'll often refer to the mirror of the great man of history, conceit, which is already kind of problematic, but now it's the great villain of history. And
right.
We talked about this last week, but just to bring you into that conversation, have you seen Legend of Korra? Avatar: Legend of Korra?
No, I have not.
So, mild spoilers for that. Are you planning to see it at some point?
Spoil away.
Okay. One of the things that the show I think does a great job of addressing is in season 2, in one of the seasons, our villain who wants chaos kills a clearly evil, terrible, dictatorial ruler of one of the main countries. And it seems you're kind of like, well, I don't like this bad guy, but I'm kind of rooting for him that he did that. The problem is now, by the next season, that country has devolved into utter and total chaos. And because, and so now there's...
And 1 million people starved to death.
Yeah, and now there's like 10 warlords who are all fighting, and another warlord comes out. And so it's all part of the unintended consequences, but it's also this idea of like, the problem wasn't one monarch. The problem was that the people had so baked into their concept the idea of monarchy and wanting strong rule that it was always going to kind of default in that direction. And,
right.
And I think that's often the, you go back and kill Hitler, you still get Himmler, And so would it actually be more effective to, go back and gently, gradually improve the economic conditions of Germany in the 1920s so that Hitler doesn't have such a wealth of hate to draw on to rise into power?
Right. Would it be better to go back and kill Woodrow Wilson so the Treaty of Versailles comes out differently?
Well, but even that, now you're still killing a person.
Right.
Yeah.
Would it be like get him voted out of office and get Teddy Roosevelt in it for the second term instead?
Well, I guess the one I'm saying is I feel like the time travel stories that I think would make more sense is where you're going back in time to do a much more gradual, much more, societal change. But that doesn't make good. That doesn't make good movies. Like punching. You can't punch capitalism in the face. You can punch a capitalist,
Yes.
And I think maybe that's kind of where I get so many of my tensions about, and I think a lot of other people have their problems with time travel is all the things that could make time travel make logical and moral sense often go really against making time travel a good story.
Yeah. Exactly. There's a very small handful of like really, really good time travel stories, and there's a lot of like super sloppy ones, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the things that helps time travel the most, some of my favorite time travel stories are actually in fantasy, not science fiction, because fantasy is not obligated to explain itself, right? That's one of the features of fantasy novel is it's magic. A wizard did it.
Yeah.
And so my favorite Terry Pratchett novel is actually Night Watch, which is a time travel story. Samuel Vimes, the tough cop archetype that he's built, travels back in time to when he was first joining the Watch.
Right.
And as mentioned, this is a story about regret, like what things went wrong at the beginning of his life. He got involved in a revolution, and that revolution went badly. Well, what would happen if now that he's old and he's been dropped back into time, he gets to change the revolution? Would that change the outcome of the future? As it turns out, nothing changed. He didn't want to change it.
Yeah.
He said he talks to the history monks who are talking to him, and he's like, the thing that I want is to go back to the life that I had.
Yeah.
And they're like, that doesn't currently exist.
Yeah.
You need to unstep this butterfly, basically, right?
Right.
Which is, as you mentioned, one of the big, you screwed something up in history, go fix it plots,
Yeah.
right?
I mean, every episode of Legends of Tomorrow is basically this.
Right. But this is a story. This is an intensely personal story about this character, and like he knows every step of the revolution, and he asks himself, if I was in charge of the revolution, what would I do? And then everybody starts listening to him because he's had 40 years of being a leader of people, right?
Right.
And he's like, oh, I am in charge of the revolution.
Yeah.
Well, what would I do?
Yeah, because it's a much more subtle thing than he was at first looking for.
Right. And the thing was caused by an event in another book, Thief of Time, which is about time and magic and somebody who is the avatar of Time's son and stuff. And so it isn't obligated to be logical, right? The history monks rebuilt history from scratch at one point. It's Terry Pratchett. It's satire and it's comedy, but it's a really serious, deep book about about all this stuff. It is handily my favorite Discworld novel. But fantasy, like the Dragonlance Chronicles actually has both types of time travel in it. Both the paradox-free causality there's no causality violations. Everything that happened, and you can alter the timeline.
Yeah.
And it's actually they have an in-world explanation that makes more sense than any other time travel system, which is the universe was set up by deities. It's clockwork, and then some deity came in and screwed it up. Like a deity of chaos came in and created another set of races.
Yeah.
Those races can alter the past. They're different.
Oh, interesting. I like that one.
But the normal people, humans, orcs, elves, can't change the past. They can travel back in time, and then nothing changed. They were always the ones that traveled back in time. What are you talking about?
Because that now you have a narrative conceit that acknowledges the problem of, because normally it's like if one consequence matters, all consequences have to matter. But now if you can set something up where these people can cause consequences, but these people don't. Yeah, I like that concept.
And then a human character figures this out because he's trapped. He went back in time in order to do a bunch of stuff and ascend to godhood.
Nice.
And then he finds out that he can't because he didn't ascend to godhood in the past, so he can't.
So all these, especially when first of all, the Sam Vimes thing I think is great. I definitely want to get you on as a at some point to have a discussion about the ethics of Discworld and probably specifically the Night Watch. I saw a post at one point where someone said, can anyone think of anyone they would actually want to be running police in this world today? And the first response was Sam Vimes. And I was like, yeah.
Carrot Iron Founderson would also be an acceptable choice. Either one of them.
Also true.
Yes.
But the point being, the story about regret, it kind of takes us back all the way to the original question we we're talking about. One of the things that makes me realize is I'd be really interested to see stories about a situation where a character wants to go back and fix the thing that went wrong in their life. But they have to recognize that actually a much better thing came of it. And the idea that's coming to mind is, I'm not sure if I'm just coming up with this already or if maybe this is actually a story that I heard about once or it's just a story that exists whether or not I heard about it. But imagine a situation where, a person, like you said, like they broke up with a love of their life for a bad reason. They went to grad school on the other side of the country because that was more important than that person or whatever. And they've now lived this sad life always wishing that they could go back and be with that person again. But it's somehow like through the course of the story, what they realize is that the heartbreak of the breakup caused their partner to decide to like focus all of their feelings instead of on sadness about the breakup into their studies or into activism. And to some extent, like that breakup propelled this person to have a great effect on the world in a way that if they didn't, it wouldn't happen. And now this person now our hero is faced with the choice of, do I go back and get to lead the nice romantic life I wanted to, if it means that now, like, this breakthrough in science doesn't happen, or this, like, major activist movement doesn't happen?
That also raises another question about time travel, which is, do characters besides the protagonists in a time travel story have agency?
Yes.
And
that question I just brought up about City on the Edge of Forever, does the peace activist get to know that she has to die? Does she get to make the choice for herself?
Because that's morally weird that they just decide to let her die, right? From Spock's perspective, from a purely logical consequentialist, the past already happened. What are we doing perspective? Spock's perspective is she's already dead. We need to go.
Right.
From McCoy's perspective, he's got the Hippocratic Oath: do no harm, save lives when possible. But does Edith Keeler have any agency in this? She really doesn't. She's a cardboard cutout as far as the story's concerned, right?
Well, because it's an idea of who has the consequences. Like this is very much a like McCoy, Spock, and Kirk are PCs. She's an NPC by the rules of that story, you know.
And some things deal with it. Travelers deals with it by just the Travelers. That's one of the core conceits of the show. Actually, is they start by believing that they're the only people that matter. Everybody else is irrelevant. The only people that matter are Travelers. Humans from the past, they already died.
Yeah. And
then they come to the conclusion that no, these people are alive right now in front of us, and they matter, and their choices matter. Right? Why should we save their lives right now in front of us? We're talking about the future. Right? And then they come to the conclusion more and more. They're like, oh, that's a really dumb and weird thing to think, because they're immediately in front of me making decisions.
Well, yeah, because it's so much of it's about what is it that matters to you. Like I'm now thinking a fun time travel story. The original co-host of the show and a frequent guest still, Paul Hoppy, he's a vegan. I'm thinking you could have a cool story about a group of vegans who basically go all the way back to prehistory and try to find like every moment where for the first time like a group of people ate the flesh of an animal and they poison it to try and get those people to think, no, we shouldn't eat animals, you know? That's probably far too broad a thing just in terms of anthropology, but like it's an interesting idea because to that group of people, the preservation of animal life, you know, it would be, you could literally, from that understanding, save billions and billions of lives.
But then you are also deleting all of the future chickens, right? Like, that chickens don't lead good lives in factory farms, but fundamentally the factory farm causes them to live.
Right.
Is it a net positive or negative to delete them from existence?
Yeah. I mean, and that's why I really appreciate what you're doing, because I think what this is helping me better understand is that if you can look past the logical fallacies of time travel, the moral questions it raises are actually fascinating and really interesting. I think the problem is that so many time travel stories, either they get lost in the time travel mechanics instead of the ethics of it, or they just do the time travel mechanics so badly that it doesn't make any sense.
Right. And so, like, my pitch is for stories that actually talk about this a bunch. A Sound of Thunder, obviously. The thing that the butterfly effect comes from. If you want to read ones, have you heard of the first 15 lives of Harry August?
I haven't.
Okay. It's the protagonist is Harry August, who is an Ouroboran, or they call them Kalchakras in the book as well. They have different names for what they are. Every time they die, they are reborn as themselves at the start of their life. Their life is on a loop. And it's a time travel story because he lives through 15 lives in the book, right? But all the other Kalchakras are running around and doing stuff. And there's no explanation. They don't understand it. They don't need an explanation, right? That's just the way that life is for them. But they have these moral quandaries about other people being NPCs. What happens if you change the future? What happens when you change things enough that another Kalchakra isn't born? Are you killing them? And so there's a bunch of this that goes on, and there's obviously a big struggle between different characters, and it's a book that treats time travel as a real serious ethical thing that also drives a plot that you really couldn't do otherwise.
Ooh, this is a book I'd love to read. This sounds really interesting.
Oh, it's very good.
Yeah.
By Claire North.
Okay.
The End of Eternity by Isaac Asimov, because I'm a big Isaac Asimov fan, treats things very, very well. Yeah. Like I said, the protagonist doesn't realize that there's moral and ethical questions buried in all the decisions that he makes, but Asimov is very aware of that.
Well, yeah. So
because
and we'll put all these links to all these, or at least the title of all these books in there. I'm now, however, going to take away your own agency for your own good, because you said you wanted to keep this to about 60 to 90 minutes, but I'm sure we'd have so much fun talking about it more.
I was looking at the time, and that's why I was talking about these other things to check out. I had a couple others, and then do we want to tag out at that point?
I was just going to say,
because I'm just going through.
Yeah, is there any kind of if there's one last sort of question you think we haven't gotten into, or I think maybe we could just put those books in the notes, and if you want to just write a sentence or two for our people who look at it that way. But yeah, what's kind of if there's one last question or idea that we haven't talked about yet that you want to make sure we get into?
So the other question that you can really ask about agency is the biggest one, which is who gives you the right.
Right.
Because you made the time machine, does that give you the right to decide the future?
Yeah.
That's very arrogant. However, a lot of people get put in that situation day to day. What gives the President of the United States the right to make the decision about whether or not to launch nukes at other countries?
Well, and fundamentally, I think this is actually just the most fundamental superhero ethic question. Is it's the Peter Parker question: does great power come with great responsibility? Whether that power is the ability to go back through time, or the ability to punch really hard, or the ability to buy everyone out of poverty. And it's interesting, I think, especially because for all the things we've talked about, like if you don't know the consequences, or you don't recognize your own biases, or anything like that. One thing I'm just thinking of is, imagine if time travel was just like easily available to everybody. A parent is watching their child, basically die of drug addiction. Can they go back in time to change, to take the needle out of their child's arm for the first time? When it seems like that's an objective good. But again, also how much is that our different perceptions on drug use and things like that? And or would it be better to go back and, make sure that child gets good addiction treatment or something like that? Like there's just, it's all these questions that open up. And I think they all stem from this idea of, why do you get to make that decision, or who gets to make that decision?
Right. And when you go back to that child and you know that they're going to, get their first heroin at this particular friend's party. You go back in time and you ground them a week before that and then prevent them from doing so. And you're successful. And you stop them from doing that. That makes the child in the future a different person.
Yeah.
Because people are the sum of experiences and the pattern that is ourselves, right? And so you changed that person. Is that killing the addict?
Yeah.
That they become 20 years down the road?
I mean, it's a very different question, but this is the Tuvix question from Star Trek. We have two people who are melded into one person. And it's do you watch Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.?
I have watched some of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. I stopped partway through. I should probably pick it back up.
They do a version of the forked history, but where it's about people living in an artificial intelligence. It's sort of basically an alternate reality online. It's basically sort of the biggest MMORPG, but real. And one of the really questions I get into is okay, so you have these computer programs that are that are living real lives in this thing. 'Cause it's not really a computer; it's kind of somewhat magical.
Right.
If you turn it off, all those people die. They blink out of existence. They stop.
The simulation question.
Yeah. And I feel like that's the mechanic to create the question is different, but it's the exact same question as the forked timeline thing.
This isn't quite that. My question is, assuming that you don't have a forked timeline, there's a single changeable timeline. The standard caveat. If I go back in time and say that there's a timeline where my child becomes a drug addict, and I see that, and I go back 10 years before that, and I stop them from getting exposed to it. The person who is the drug addict, that 10 years down the line, that 10 years of experiences are different.
Yeah.
Right? I deleted them. I removed them from existence. They're gone now. The person 10 years in the future is different. They're a different person, quantitatively and qualitatively. Right?
Yeah, I get your point there. Because it's how are you, on some extent, you're now deciding that person's life would be better, and so you should. That therefore the non-prime, the non-optimal version, gets destroyed.
Right. Back to the Future. Biff Tannen in the bad evil timeline, right, where he has destroyed the city. He had a good life.
Yeah. He
enjoyed his life. He was the hero of his own story, basically, right? But that Biff Tannen he's when you go back in time and you fix things and you bring it back to the normal timeline, Biff Tannen's good life is deleted. The Biff Tannen that won at life, that opened a casino, that controlled everything, that person is gone.
Yeah.
Is that murder?
Yeah, it's murder, and maybe because basically what you're deciding is that the world is better off if these people live, but these people don't. And that's what Hitler thought.
This set of
that's what any of these people thought. And there's just so much hubris that has to get involved.
Right.
And going back to the question I raised a while ago about, what if you could save all these lives not by going back and killing Hitler, but instead by going back and killing Christopher Columbus? Or, in some other way, like killing the right people to end the sort of colonization of Northern America. I imagine that if an American invented the time machine versus if a European or some other non-American invented it, they'd approach the question differently. Because we can, I feel like I'm one of the biggest people who would say, like, the colonization of North America was wrong and terrible. But, and I think, if you had the chance to undo that, I think objectively you absolutely should. Subjectively, though, I know that means that I don't exist. That everything that is American doesn't exist. And it's hard for me I know that my brain catches on that idea. And I think that's why I shouldn't make that decision.
Right. You delete a billion people.
Right.
It's not that they die. They just never were.
Right. And you replace them with probably a huge other number of people, so it's not that it's a zero, we're not saying how many lives get deleted. It's just someone's still deciding that these people's lives would have had more moral value than this other group.
Right. And that's weird and troubling because that's a question that comes up in real life too. We talked about Chairman Mao, right? Chairman Mao made that decision all of the time.
Yeah.
Right? That's one of the things that is bad about him is he made the decision to trade lives for other lives constantly, and we don't think that the lives that he traded were good. Or I don't.
Well, and I think I mostly agree with you there, but I also think I've read moral arguments from some philosophers who say, like, look at the state of modern China today that is deeply problematic in a lot of ways, but the amount of starvation, the amount of economic deprivation that happens there, because the Great Leap Forward both Stalin and Mao dramatically increased their country's industrialization at the expense of millions and millions of lives.
Exactly. That's why I picked on Mao, because that's an obvious decision in trade that he made. Right. And the question is, like I said, you don't have to resort to time travel for most of the plots that time travel goes to.
Right.
Because they're real, actual moral issues. But time travel lets you pack it into a smaller space and have fewer characters to make a bunch of the same points.
Yeah. It's a lot. And like I said, we could do an entire series on time travel. And I feel like now, basically anytime a big time travel movie comes out, I'm just going to get you back on. Because I think there's an interesting way to analyze these things. Because we can look at both what are the logical questions. To me, there's three levels of analysis. It's what are the logical questions? What are the moral questions? And what's the balance that the writers have to do between the logic and the morality versus the storytelling? I would get into all of those. So Rob, I know you wanted to get to your dinner, but folks, I know you would be happy to continue these conversations, and I will speak in a moment about how they can continue the conversation with you on the superhero ethics pages. But if they want to hear your thoughts on other stuff, where can people find stuff you're thinking about or talking about outside of this particular question?
Plugging my pluggables. So I guest on a couple other podcasts frequently enough. I'm on Good Luck High Five every few months to talk about upcoming Magic sets and Magic rules stuff because I'm a Magic judge.
This is Magic the Gathering for anyone who doesn't know.
Magic the Gathering, tabletop card game. Don't expect content outside of Magic. It will be entirely foreign to you if you don't do Magic. Meg and Maria are fantastic, but it's focused to its job and it does its job well. There's also, if you like geekery stuff, I have been on the Geek Bracket a couple of times, which is a podcast quiz show that's run by Judge JP, and JP's great, and we cover all sorts of stuff, and I definitely got smashed with wrestling trivia questions last time, which I know actual zero about.
That's awesome.
So and I'm going to be on again in the end of the month, September 30th, I think is when we're recording, so it'll be sometime next month. I'll be on there. Check out both those podcasts. They're great. They're fun times.
Awesome. Yeah, I've heard. I've only heard a little bit of the Geek Bracket, but I really enjoyed it. But I definitely heard you on Good Luck High Five a number of times. And for those people who are into Magic the Gathering, it's a great thing. But for all of you, what do you all think of time travel? I know clearly they keep making time travel movies, and Matthew Carroll, especially the founder originally of the Stranded Panda Podcast Network, or at least one of the main founders, he's a big fan of it. And I imagine many of you are as well. What do you think? Do you agree with the kind of logical breakdown we gave? Do you disagree? Do you have other thoughts? Do you think we should throw all this out because time travel is just fun and who cares, let us know. You can find us on Facebook or Twitter at Superhero Ethics. You can also email us, superheroethics@gmail.com. And all that and more you can find on the Stranded Panda Podcast Network website, just strandedpanda.com. There you can find stuff about other podcasts I'm doing, other podcasts that some of our other great hosts are doing. Here we have kind of an ethical perspective, but there's also podcasts that just do deep dives on Marvel, DC, Star Trek, Star Wars, a number of other great properties, as well as the Bingers Assemble and PandaVision podcasts, which just kind of take a look at movies or TV shows that are beloved by geeks in either but don't have their own whole verse. So Bingers Assemble for the movies, PandaVision for the TV shows. And by the time you hear this, PandaVision will have started a discussion of The Boys Season 2 that I'll be on, where we're going to, for each episode, put an episode out. Great TV show, raises a lot of great questions that I think are very vital to what we talk about here. Definitely should check it out, and hopefully check out the podcast. So, Rob, thank you again so much. Thank you to all of you listeners for being a part of this. Have a great day.